I'm Dana Bibi of the programs team at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. Thank you for joining us today for a reading and conversation with Ruqaya Izzidien. We are delighted to bring you a discussion of her debut novel, The Watermelon Boys. Ruqaya Izzidien is an Iraqi Welsh writer. She served as the London Book Fair's writer-in-residence in Sharjah and contributed to Just So You Know, a collection of essays from Welsh writers. As a journalist, her work has appeared in the New York Times, Al Jazeera, The New Statesman, The New Arab, The National, and the BBC. She runs the blog Muslim Impossible, which reviews inaccurate depictions of Arabs and Muslims in television, film, and literature. Ruqaya's debut novel, The Watermelon Boys, received a Betty Trask Award for first-time novelists under 35. Ruqaya's writing has been described by reviewers as sensitive and lyrical, beautifully rendered in rich and evocative prose, and Tolstoyan in the number of characters and subplots. Other reviews assert that The Watermelon Boys will linger in your mind as it is a powerful, beautiful novel demanding to be read by anyone interested in World War I fiction, and even those who are not. We are pleased to be involved and to have the opportunity to share this work with a broader audience. The global centers are hubs of Columbia University, currently in 9 cities around the world, that work with students, faculty, and regional partners to create opportunities for shared learning and research, and to deepen the nature of global dialogue on a range of issues. This book talk is the third in a series that features Arab authors to showcase some of the breadth and diversity in Arab fiction writing. Much of the English literature portraying the Middle Eastern theater of the First World War centers on various European icons, such as Lawrence of Arabia, or large events such as the Gallipoli campaign. While The Watermelon Boys is set during and immediately after the First World War, in what is now present-day Iraq, Ruqaya reclaims the mainstream narrative by paralleling several perspectives of those involved but marginalized in history and in English language fiction. In particular, the voice of the Iraqis is compassionately represented. This book is a unique contribution to post-colonial literature and the impactful unfolding story of hope and struggle, culture and family, war and life, still relevant across the Middle East and North Africa today. I would now like to hand over to Tasnim Qutait, our moderator for this conversation. Tasnim is a postdoctoral researcher at Uppsala University in Sweden. Her research interests are in translation studies and world literature, with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. Her book, Nostalgia in Anglophone Arab Literature, Nationalism, Identity, and Diaspora, is forthcoming from Bloomsbury this May. She's currently writing a book on the cultural politics of security in the Arab diaspora. Thank you again to everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. Please do send in your questions through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen so that they will be addressed in this webinar. Please join me in welcoming Tasnim.
Thank you for the introductions, Dana, and thank you to the Amman Columbia Global Center for this series, highlighting the work of Arab writers, which I think is much needed, and for hosting this conversation. I am very much looking forward to talking with Ruqaya about her novel and the challenges and inspirations of her work. If you have any questions as we are speaking, please do put them into the chat and we will take as many as we can in the time we have. So here is my copy of the book that we are discussing today. I had the opportunity to read and review The Watermelon Boys when it first came out in 2018. It was and still is the first English language novel that I have read about the aftermath of the First World War, which is told from the perspective of Iraqis. For those of you who have not yet read the novel, I wanted to give a brief and spoiler-free description. This is a novel with 2 main storylines. The first follows the protagonist Ahmed, as he first decides to join the British in fighting against the Ottomans, and then to fight against the British for Iraqi independence. Then we have a second narrative which follows Carwyn, from his childhood in a mining village in Wales to his reluctant decision to enlist in the British Army. And then these 2 storylines connect when Carwyn takes part in the Mesopotamia campaign, where his fate is linked with that of Ahmed and his sons Ahmed and Yusuf. So this is a 300-page novel, and there's a lot more going on. It spans different, it has a large cast of characters, and it kind of weaves together all of these different storylines. But that is a brief summary of what the novel is about. Now, to set the stage for our conversation and to give you a feel for the narrative style, Ruqaya has kindly agreed to read a little for us, I think from somewhere around the middle of the novel, right, Ruqaya?
Yeah, it's actually around 3/4 of the way through, I think. And it's a slightly abridged version of the chapter that takes place during the start, sort of the simmering of the Arab revolt. And just to add a little bit of context, you've mentioned Ahmed, who's the protagonist, and his sons Yusuf and Ahmad. And we also see in this chapter Dabriya, who's his wife, and Luma, who's their daughter, sorry. Should I go ahead with my reading?
Yes, please.
Chapter 46, Spring 1920, Baghdad. Men who dabble in war and conquest seldom understand the value of identity. Is there a possession more volatile or valuable? And to steal such a thing, to maim it beyond recognition, triggers a fracture that festers in the veins of progeny for eternity. It rips souls into unnavigable pieces, until the world and time and everything that was ever thought indestructible crumbles like it never was. It is a theft that can never be undone. But in the spring of 1920, the rift was still just a crack, and time would decide whether it would split, forming a fracture for generations, or whether it would be defended, healed, reclaimed. And so as the British mobilized to establish the mandate of Iraq, with arbitrarily drawn borders that joined together 3 independent regions, the people of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra came together to defend their futures. With each day of fasting, the fervor of revolution grew more palpable, like static that passed inaudibly between strangers. A tingling, untouchable rebellion swelled in the air. It blew through the country with the Shamal sands until almost every village in the central Euphrates was home to worshippers calling for revolt, or men who had deserted their posts in British governance, or tribal leaders withholding taxes from their new rulers. When the final day of Ramadan fell upon Iraq, it was as though the whisper of revolution was all anyone consumed. There was an air of celebration in the Midan of Baghdad. Ramadan had ended, and whether from the success of the revolt further south, or the sense of community that the rebellion had fostered, hope filled the air. Admittedly, it was bolstered by the waft of charcoal kebabs and syrupy sweets, but there was hope nonetheless. Dabriya was glad to join Ahmed and her sons. She brushed away her reservations about bringing her children to the biggest square in the city during a rebellion by telling herself that they needed to see it. But the truth was that she needed to see it, to know that her sacrifice had been worthwhile, and had been safe so far. Luma had her hair in braids for the occasion, and Dabriya had brought out her nicest abaya with a heavy belt of embroidery at the waist. She scolded Luma for being too noisy, but everyone knew her heart wasn't in it, not on a day like today. And in the state of uncertainty, people found hope in the certainty that things would never be the same. They walked around the alleyways as they ate their kebabs, wiping their fingers with the last pieces of spongy flatbread. Ahmad burped and they all laughed. When they had finished, it was almost midday. Dabriya gave Ahmed a nod and held his forearm for a second, before rushing Luma to the tailor at the other side of the square, dragging Ahmad and Yusuf with her. Once they were inside, Dabriya indicated to the owner that she wanted Luma measured, and went to stand by the shop entrance. In that square, at that moment, if you looked away, or you blinked for too long, or even sneezed too ferociously, you'd have missed the signal. It took just a few seconds for the 8 men to catch one another's eyes and break into a chant. Dabriya watched Ahmed draw a breath and yell, "Baghdad for!" "Baghdadis," called 7 men in reply. The second time, the returning chant doubled in strength. "Baghdadis," whispered Dabriya to herself. And when the chant had developed a life of its own, Ahmed, Jafar, and Ali set up a platform from a wobbly wooden table. Jafar put a hand on Ahmed's shoulder for a moment, then helped him up onto it. Ahmed took a shaky breath and called, "People of Baghdad." Faces turned toward him, but the noise died only a little. This was his chance to fight, not for the English, not for the Turks, but for himself and for his city. "People of Baghdad," said Ahmed, louder. "Brothers and sisters, Shia and Sunni, Jew and Assyrian, Chaldean and Armenian. The only noise left in the Midan was the sizzling of kebabs and titters of curiosity. Ahmed took a gulp of air. It is time to reclaim your dignity. He thought of all the things from which he had run, all the wrongs he had done, Karim and Salim, the lives he had taken and the lies he had believed, but he would not let the invaders defeat him. He took a deep breath. This was it. From the first day that they came here, the English have lied to us. They promised us freedom, and we gave our souls, our lives, and our children's lives for this dream. As soon as Ahmed felt the anger rise in his stomach, his nerves slipped away. He brandished his forefinger, too enraged to mind that everyone was watching him. They made us slaves to a concept that we never dared to dream of, and they rewarded our loyalty by beating us, imprisoning us, and murdering us. A scattered applause broke out. They call us savages, barbarians, dirty, uncivilized Badus, yet we are not the ones who broke our word. Ahmed saw nodding and raised fists in the crowd. He scanned the edges of the square, but saw no British guards yet, so he continued. We sacrificed everything to be released from Constantinople, only to be dragged away in English shackles, and still you ask us to thank you. You English say we are politically naive, yet you have joined North and South under one law when they have never been joined before. Well, now you can be sure that we are united in our fight against you, Basris, Baghdadis, Mosulis, united against our colonizers. To the English, Arabs are not humans. A lie to an Arab is not a lie. Theft from an Arab is not theft. The murder of an Arab is not murder. And yet they laugh with one another at how dishonorable the Arabs are. The Englishman breaks his word more carelessly and more frequently than he breaks wind. Laughter rippled across the audience, and Ahmed's heart lightened. And I think we all know how their weak foreign stomachs tolerate our savage food over here, he added, pinching his nose with his fingers as the people of the Midan laughed harder still. Today is the end of their integrity. It is the end of their honor. But today is the beginning of a new and just Baghdad. The crowd jumped and cheered, and he raised his fist to the sky and inhaled all the air of his beloved Baghdad. And with this one breath, he blew it across the rooftops of the city. We are Baghdadis, and Baghdad is ours. It was the breath that turned a spark into a blazing fire.
Thank you for that, Ruqaya. So to start off our conversation, would you talk a little bit about the idea for this novel, how it first came to you? If you remember the very first moment that you decided that you wanted to write a novel focused on this particular era of Iraq's history.
It actually started out as something completely different. I kind of had this idea for, it all started when my grandfather, who's Iraqi, on my Iraqi side, passed away. And I sort of knew a few of his stories, and I felt, I sort of saw this idea of a novel that would be combined by this figure. So let's say many different stories that all related to him in different ways, from his descendants and nephews and cousins and all of that. But then the more I learned about Jiddu, my grandfather's story, the more I felt like there was so much to tell there. And a lot of it was so historically poignant and even politically poignant events that I hadn't seen, and I still haven't seen documented anywhere else. So it started with a sort of sense of duty that, like, once I had found out about this, there was no going back. And this is like, that set the kind of domino effect for what this novel would become. So that's how it started, but so many things got jumbled up in along the way. I started with 2 events that happened to my great-grandfather. And the first is the very first scene. And in my great-grandfather's case, he was found there, and in the novel, he's found by his wife, the character that's sort of, it's not based on my great-grandfather at all because it's completely fiction. The second spoiler, so I won't go into it, but it happens in the novel, and it involves Jewish neighbors. So this was something that happened to my great-grandfather as well. that was told to our family, just told to us when we were growing up from my grandfather, and I never saw it documented anywhere else. So it started with these kind of bookends, and then I actually used this timeline software, and I plotted in historical events on one bar, ideas for the key characters who actually it started off with like 3 key characters, and it became completely different as I wrote it, but plotting in historical events and then tying that into how I wanted the Ahmed story to develop. And Cadwyn was kind of a coincidental thing. Like you read The Watermelon Boys now, and it seems like there's this very obvious parallel between how the English treat Cadwyn, who's Welsh, and how the English treat Ahmed, who's obviously Iraqi. But it was such a organic development. I knew I needed to have some kind of interaction with the British and a personal interaction. And I mean, my background, growing up in Wales, and he ended up being Welsh, and somehow although like I'm not at all inclined at the discrimination that Welsh people and Iraqis face is similar or on the same scale at all, that did exist in Wales at the time, this sort of suppression of the Welsh identity. And I think it made for an interesting dynamic, and one that actually surprised me a lot of the time how I thought, for example, Ahmed and Cadwyn would interact when they met. I was like, well, Ahmed's a decent guy trying to do the right thing, and so is Cadwyn. So you would expect them maybe to get along, and that's happened. And there's this interesting clash that I didn't expect until the moment that I wrote it, and I was like, well, obviously they're not going to like each other. What am I thinking? So I've rambled on a bit, but that's kind of how it sort of developed and the key stages of it.
No, that makes a lot of sense, that the parallel, I really had the sense that you had plotted the parallel from the beginning, because it is so integral to the book, but it also makes sense that that you kind of, it grows organically as well, and the way they meet and the way the storylines come together. I wanted to pick up on one thing that you mentioned in relation to the politically poignant, I think you said politically poignant era, because this is this era of transition from Ottoman to colonial rule and its aftermath, which is, I think, essential to understanding the region's current situation. Let's put it that way. In relation to that, I'd like to ask you to speak about what you think fiction, because you're also a journalist, so you were already a writer before writing your debut novel. What do you think fiction can do that is maybe not possible in journalism or in nonfiction more broadly?
I mean, I would clarify that I would define myself more as a retired journalist now. It was sort of a gateway into writing, and I found myself more drawn to fiction. I mean, I feel like the obvious answer is that it's more accessible to people who wouldn't normally read, let's say, an article about Iraq 100 years ago. Whereas if you tell them there's a story about a father who's trying to do the right thing, and his city is invaded by 2 conflicting forces, and he is sort of duped by promises from one power, it's a lot easier to lose yourself in fiction. It's a lot easier to make it more accessible to an audience that wouldn't normally engage in that kind of history. And I think that's really poignant for me as a British Iraqi who, I mean, I grew up not learning. I studied history for obviously several years at school, and all we learned about was like America's crimes, nothing about ours. And like Prussia and the Tudors, and there's nothing about relevant political history that actually still affects us today. We're talking 2-3 generations. We're not talking, of a really long time ago. And I think that also comes back to where we are today as, I'm sort of talking as a British society, because that was, I saw my book both for an Arab audience, but obviously English speaking, and within my realm that equated to the British audience. So you have like these recent studies that tell you that like 44, like almost half of Britain think that that the empire was a force for good, and you try and it's like a taboo topic that you can't even debate, like whether Winston Churchill had ever done anything bad in his entire life, because it's like absolutely red line, we can't discuss this. And I think that all of these things, sort of like the lack of education and the kind of shielding of society from our history, they just make politics and history and our own history like this. Yes, so The Watermelon Boys is a novel set in Iraq, but it's also a British history. So we used to, as Arabs, Brits, we're used to reading about the Arab world from an English perspective. That's like the dominant narrative. And it was really satisfying for me to be able to write about not just Iraq, but to write about British history from an Iraqi perspective, which is so rare. And anyway, that for me was poignant. And I think novels, not specifically my novel, but novels that challenge the dominant narrative and that are accessible and don't alienate too much a wider audience, but push them to challenge the beliefs that are held and the beliefs that they're brought up with, and the lack of knowledge, and to sort of expand the kind of information that they consume. I think that's how I hope that novels can, or literature can, kind of widen minds.
Definitely. And I think what you shared about that experience of reading history and studying history, and history being a particular thing that doesn't always tell the histories that are maybe important to consider today, will be familiar to many of us. It's certainly familiar to me. You mentioned that Ahmed is a father, and that's a significant and important part of the novel. And as I was rereading it now for our conversation, I was struck by how many moments he is represented as a father who is fearful for his children's future. So there's a really nice quote from the novel where you say, he's kind of wondering, how do you confess fear to a child when you have sworn the world is safe? How do you promise security to a child who lives through war? And these moments really stood out to me as I was reading it now. I wanted to ask you if it was your intention from the start to tell a different kind of story about war, or did that focus on parenting in the midst of violence, for example? Did that emerge as you were writing Ahmed's character?
To be honest, never really, and almost still don't really see it as a novel set during a war, or like a war novel. It was always intended to be something that's like a background to the struggles that Ahmed's family, and there are a bunch of other sort of secondary characters as well. So it was intended to be, a backdrop for them, and a sort of opportunity for these characters to explore their identities and explore their possibilities and their futures during a really tempestuous time. And it did, like, once I had finished it and I started describing it, I really struggled to not categorize it as, or to describe it without mentioning the war, which is obviously a large part of what happens. But I think if you look at the novel, very few of the chapters are actually action or conflict, or in fact, I can really think of just like one period of maybe a few chapters where Ahmed is in like conflict, and that's pretty much it. You see like the exchanges between soldiers, you see how each of the two sons try to subvert the system that's imposed on them. So it was definitely supposed to be more of like a family story than like primarily about these relationships between them, and how the kind of fracturing of a country fractures families and identities and affects every single interaction, not just within the family, but within different communities, like between different ethnic communities and religious communities. And I mean, we see that even today in wars, that like it's not just like there's a conflict, but your life continues, and people adapt. Unfortunately, almost people adapt to whatever situation they're put under. So yeah, I would say it was like definitely like accelerated, or even like if the primary focus was on these families and these individual relationships, and not at all like supposed to be a kind of war fiction, which we see a lot of. I mean, a different war, but I think it's like 90% of or this is just an aside, but like 90% of fiction, English language fiction set in Iraq is written by like soldiers, and it's war fiction from the more recent Iraq war. So that was also a consideration. That's, I mean, I avoid them. I don't think I've read a single one, and I don't ever want to.
Yeah, absolutely. That was something I was also going to mention. English language fiction about Iraq today. There was a real surge after the 2003 invasion, but it tended to tell a certain kind of story, which is definitely missing the kind of intimacy that you're describing now. In English language media, and in particular novels set during this era, Arabs are either absent or at best supporting actors, and the Arab world is sort of a setting or the field for the battles between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies.
Yeah. And even worse, you know, sometimes it's not even like, you find novels set not just in Iraq but in the Arab world during this era or during major surges for independence, and you'll find that there's like, it's pitched as this kind of novel in the blurb, and then there's not a single, for example, Tangerine is a novel that was released in 2018, I think, and it's set during the Moroccan struggle for independence, and the title is Tangerine, as in from Tanja. And there's literally not even a single Moroccan, not a single mention of the war, of the struggle for independence. There's one Moroccan, I think, that's mentioned, and he's like this mysterious lurking figure in the alleyways of the Medina. That's just like this exotified shadow under which to set a novel that could have been set in any other country, but you set it in Morocco because it's like, I think the blurb read something like the darkened mosquito. Anyway, it describes the Sahara, which also, by the way, isn't even in Tanja, which is a Mediterranean green city. But anyway, yeah, it's a problem, and it's not that my novel was a reaction to these kinds of. There's tens of them, not just. And they're usually female protagonists, and they're often in like the 20s in Egypt, or I mean, there's many of them set in Egypt. I've read one series that was set in Iraq during the British occupation of Iraq in the 20s. That also had very few Arab characters, and you'll find they're all described with these really borderline racist descriptions of their like hooked nose and sweaty and dirty and filthy, and the streets are infested and the children are raggedy and all of this. And then the characters get no resolution. They have no complexity, if they even exist. They have no complexity. They have names that aren't even researched. There was this one novel that had an Arab character named Captain Hamar, like Captain Donkey. Like I don't. They're just not researched. Like, you wouldn't write a novel about heart surgery and not consult a heart surgeon to know how to write it. And you just find it's just like anyone can write a novel set in the Arab world, because it's like this mystical land that almost doesn't really exist to the Western world. We can just do whatever we want. And you see that with Aladdin. It's like this wondrous, fantastical non-place. Anyway, sorry, that's why I have this blog, to let out these emotions.
No, absolutely. I mean, that frustration and the frustration that it's still an ongoing issue. I mean, I was thinking recently about video games, which constantly create an Agrabah, basically a Middle East country that doesn't really exist. That's just a hodgepodge of different things that they wanted to pick up. And I think, other than your novel, the only sort of narrative that I'm aware of set during this era that centers Arab voices is Naji Abu Nawar's Deeb, film from 2014, which focuses on Bedouins and their experience of the war. But could you talk a little bit about what does it feel like to introduce this lacking narrative to a global audience? Do you feel the burden of representation in any way, or is that something that you willingly sort of take on that doesn't feel like a difficult or a challenging thing to you?
I mean, the thing is, when I wrote it, I had no idea it would be published. It started out with this, like I explained, this kind of like need to write my grandfather's story and to write it no matter what, no matter whether it was published or not. And then obviously it was published, and you know, sometimes, especially if you've grown up as sort of othered in the West, you kind of have lived with that burden of representation and othering, and it's not something that I normally voluntarily undertake. But I think in the case of the Watermelon Boys in Iraq in the 1920s, it's something that I feel like I almost have a PhD in now, so I feel like I'm an authority on it, and I don't mind, like, so long as, and this is just, you know, I guess my rule would be that so long as an author is happy to talk about a certain topic or a certain era, then that's fine, but it's not something that should be kind of thrust upon them to be the spokesperson. And also I am from the Iraqi diaspora. I can't really speak to like what Iraq is like now or has been like in this generation, but I do think there's so much information lacking and awareness that, I mean, I feel like this is something that British people, specifically British people, need to know more about, and I'm kind of happy to take on that role for now. I might change my mind one day.
Yeah, I can understand that. So we spoke a little bit about the text that you found frustrating. I wonder if we can speak about inspiring texts, or what kind of reading or what elements of your reading influenced your writing style, or if you were inspired by writers, whether in writing in English or Arabic, as you were, you know, deciding that you were going to write this novel.
I always get asked this, and I've had years to think about it, and I still don't have an answer. I feel like so there was so much research involved in this, and I feel like the two things that influenced it weren't really other authors. That obviously there are authors that I admire, but I can't really point to an author and be like, this is the style that I want to write, or this is how I want to write about Iraq, but let's say I read it from a different country. I don't know. I really struggle to compare myself to like another writer, and maybe that's a good thing. I don't want to be like, oh yes, I'm the next Radwa Ashur or something. Like you know what? I'm just trying my best. But I will say that I felt like the novel was informed more by what I learned along the way and like academic texts. And I did loads of research like from archives and video archives, and my dad found it was so random. He found a diary from a soldier from our village who served, like our village in Wales, who served in Iraq, and it was just like in this skip, and there wasn't really that much information in it, but it was so like, it was kind of magical to find this like golden ticket of like, well, there's just small pieces and bit like, you know, like, oh, it was really hot, and oh, there's lots of flies, and there's nothing that really informed it, but it just felt like as much information as I could gather over quite a long time that I was researching. And then like oral histories and well, there's a lot. I can't really, we're going back now. We're going back to like 2016. So that was more what kind of informed the content, I would say, of the novel, as well as being a response to what already existed in terms of English language literature about Arabs. So it was kind of not in conversation with that, but always bearing in mind how we're already being spoken about. But yeah, I can't really say that I can compare myself or say that, you know, I want to write like X, because I just don't have an answer to that. Maybe one day I will, but I don't know.
I mean, since you already talked to us about how the novel was inspired by your grandfather and his memories, it absolutely makes sense that it was oral histories and that sort of material that inspired your writing. And many of the characters in your novel sort of express nostalgia for a time that Iraq was a better place. So what you just said about oral history and memories sets up this next question that I want to ask you, which is the role that you feel nostalgia plays in your novel, in your characters, or even more personally in your own writing process.
I'll go with the easy one first, which is my own writing process. Definitely, there's a huge amount of nostalgia in the way I write. Even the subject of what I chose to write about is informed by that nostalgia and literally my grandfather's nostalgia. And I suppose like I am a product of that event one way or another, the sort of but the joining of Britain and Iraq at one point in history, and that kind of those ongoing repercussions. So I sort of feel like a product of that, of the events of the Watermelon Boys. And so for me to have grown up outside of Iraq and almost never having known what it is to belong, either in the UK or in Iraq, I think that would probably be a sort of influence for the rest of my writing career. And as for the characters, I think that is more nostalgia that I've absorbed from like the elders in my family and my community, even though we're talking a completely different generation. I feel like nostalgia is such a big part of the Arab identity, and I don't know like whether the chicken or the egg came first, whether it's a product of colonialism or whether it existed before that. I don't know, there's something, we have a soft spot for nostalgia, and it's I feel like it's something that all Arabs can relate to. That's, I don't know, that feels significant. You probably know more about this, I think.
No, I absolutely wanted to hear more from you, because I feel like what I keep thinking about as I read the novel is that nostalgia is not necessarily a sentimental emotion in it. It's something that can be empowering, or it can, it's not necessarily something to dismiss, basically.
I mean, it can be informative, right? Like, it's a product of experience. It's not just something you feel out of nowhere. Anyway, we're getting very sentimental and nostalgic.
Okay, so let's talk for a moment about the title then. And when you decided to settle on the Watermelon Boys as a title, and maybe for those who aren't familiar, explain where it comes from, because it's also on the cover of the book, and it's very much a central image of the book.
So the Watermelon Boys comes from the fact that both Ahmed, when he was a child, and his sons, when they're adolescents, grow and deliver watermelons through these guffa, like reed boats, these round coracle reed boats along the Tigris river. And I mean, that's it. That's it. When people are like, why the Watermelon Boys? That's literally it. But it was an image that was so strong to me when I first was reading about these boats and seeing the images of I mean, there's loads of them in the archives that you can see. And it was just so striking, and it actually came to me very, very early on. And I was like, am I jumping the gun a bit? Like, should I really have a title at this point? But like, very early on in my first draft, like first third maybe of my first draft. And that was it. I just liked the image. I love picking titles, and like, I don't know, there's something about that I really enjoy, and a lot of authors and editors don't like it, but I think it's so fun. And it's like, it can be anything, and it can be like a phrase, or it can be an image, and it doesn't have to summarize the book or anything. I just found it catchy and charming, and I went with it, and I feel like it's memorable as well, because then you do wonder, like, who are the Watermelon Boys, or what does this mean?
Yeah, absolutely, and specific to the context. This is something you might have already answered in a way, but we have a question from the audience relating to what is the most interesting detail you discovered while researching your book?
Ooh, good question. I don't know if this is like because I feel like there are lots to think about. Okay, maybe two. We'll go with the slightly negative one first, which was in 1922, I think it was. Once the British were properly ruling Iraq, and they had introduced this kind of aerial governance, so they would, rather than policing, which was expensive, and they were receiving a lot of like backlash from England and Westminster that they're spending all of this money in Iraq, and for what, and losing a lot of British support over it. So they started aerial governance, which was basically bombing people into submission. And so in 1922, they bombed an entire village for not paying taxes to England. And I just was astounded by this. And I couldn't believe that we didn't know about it. And then just to wash the taste out of our mouths of that one, that there was a Euphrates turtle. I thought this was so cute. I didn't know about this. And I don't think they exist anymore, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But I thought that was pretty cute.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know it existed either. And I guess these are the things that come up as you're researching, and maybe that make their way into the novel and maybe don't. Relating to sort of the process of writing and the research process, a question that you also probably get a lot relates to writing this book in English. Do you feel that your language is influenced by Arabic? Was there ever a sense of translation of dialogues, for example, of speeches, in the decision to write in English?
Yeah, I have to answer. There was definitely an influence, especially when it came to dialogue, interaction, sort of emotive expression in a way that maybe a British audience isn't as emotive in the way they, generally, stiff upper lip and all of that. But also, particularly when it came to the protest chants, I really wanted them to like sound like Arabic protest chants, not like English ones. And I had to have I really had to put my foot down when it came to, I mean, it was not a confrontational argument, but it was just like with maybe my agent or somebody who said that this chant doesn't work. And I was like, it works, can't you hear it? I think I won in the end. Not that it's about winning, but at some point, you have to especially as the person in the process, let's say between me and my agent and the person who edited my novel, like I was the authority on Arabic and Iraq, and another way that influenced actually, which was quite interesting, which was another part where I had to sort of pull rank about Arabic knowledge, was that there are times in the novel where the British are referred to the English, and there are times when they're referred to as the British. And I wanted to make the distinction between Arabs talking about the British, which would be the English, and then the narrator talking about the British, who would not know the difference, but who would automatically express that as the British rather than the English, which is what you would normally say in Arabic. You wouldn't really say the British. So there were these little kind of like nuggets throughout that I hope made for a sense of being in Iraq, or characters speaking or living authentically in that location and time. But I'm sure it's also very flawed. It's quite a hard thing to capture, and I think it might have been a point where I translated something, but it probably was the chant. But yeah, that's the long and short of it.
Yeah, I was going to say that the level of specificity that you've insisted on and the research that you've done really comes through, especially in the sense of place. The way you write setting and the way you give the reader a sense of place is really rich. And I think that insistence on what things should sound like and these details are, yeah, it's clear that the work that's been put into that part of the novel.
Thanks. That's like the one thing I wanted from it, to be like, at least it can stand up for itself rather than just be like if it, I didn't really ever feel like it was going to have a very wide reception, but I was like, I want it to be like respectable.
I mean, for example, not even the fact that you don't even use the word mashrabiyya, but you use a particular local word at that level of detail. For somebody who's familiar with the context, for somebody who's used to people writing about it and not being familiar, the contrast is stark, I think.
Thank you.
We have one more question from the audience relating to the writing process, which is, when you first started writing your novel, did you know the ending before you started, or did the ending find you, kind of organically develop?
I knew an amount of the ending because I did a lot of, I explained this like timeline software that I use. And so I knew, oh, how do we do this without spoilers? I knew kind of at what cost this whole story would come to the family. And I knew kind of the build up, the kind of climax. There's the climax and then there's the very end. And so I knew that climax and the context for that. But a lot changed. Carwyn is involved in the end, and I hadn't planned that. It sort of happened. I think it happened in a revision, actually. And then there was like a fundamental change to the very final scene, that, or like the visual final scene that we see. In fact, I think it's the very last sentence. So the content of that last sentence was changed. It's really impossible to describe this without a spoiler. I'll stop talking.
Yeah, we really need to avoid the spoilers, so I think it's best to leave it there. Kind of related again to how the writing process developed. You write from several characters' perspectives, and as I was reading, I was sort of wondering whether during the writing process were any of the characters easier to write, more difficult to write? Did you sort of resonate with one of them more than the other, or how did that work?
I found, I think I found, at times I found Ahmed quite difficult to write, especially in his scenes of conflict, probably because I've not really experienced that, anything really close to that. But other times I found him very easy. When he was emotive, when he was regretful or really feeling his loss, I found those scenes a lot easier. But actually, I would say I found Carwyn easier to write. And also Aisha, who we just see a couple of chapters, maybe 3 chapters of her. She's a secondary kind of character. She's a secondary character who just pops in, pops out. But I found her really engaging to write, and a lot of people wanted to see more. A lot of people, but like people who I shared the book with wanted to see more of her. But I was really insistent that this isn't a story about her, but it did stick in the back of my mind that like this is a character that people find easy to read and want to read more about, and maybe informed. So the book that I'm currently working on has a female protagonist who's not very similar to her, but I always bore that in mind, that like just in the back of my mind when I got that feedback, I bore it in mind, and when it came to developing my next book, I think I always knew it would be a female protagonist. So I just, she informed that in a sense. But yeah, I found her easy to write, and also Carwyn. Yeah, those two, I think.
Yeah, so that also really nicely sets up my next question. We are getting close to wrapping up, but before we do, I wanted to ask you about whether there is a question you wished you were asked more often about your writing, or something that doesn't get discussed as much as you wish.
This is a bit cheeky, but I do like it when I get asked how it feels to write about a man, like write from a man's perspective, because I always feel like it's such a, why are you asking me that? We don't ask men how it feels to write about women. I like questions that are sort of open up something controversial. But to be honest, I don't feel like, I recently did a book club meeting with Baghdad Book Club. They're a bunch of, I think, mostly journalists who live in Baghdad. And I found anything that I'd never been asked before, I was asked then, and it was really like people who really understood the context and history, and had like very targeted questions, and not just like targeted questions, but like about almost like about the metaphors and symbolism, and it was very thorough. So I don't think there's anything not really, but I do like to also to discuss. There are a couple of like puns in there that I just put in for myself, that I'd love to discuss, or I'd love to be brought up in, let's say like a Q&A that I did, or just like, I don't know, I just put them in there. Though like maybe nobody will ever see them, but they're there for me. And so I'd like them to be brought up, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, I can understand that. I have a lot of questions still, but we have some more questions coming in from the audience. So I will turn to the Q&A here, the Q&A chat. One question asks, you mentioned that a lot of other novelists have written very stereotypical depictions of the Arab world. In the writing and publishing process, were you hindered by any external expectations that you should write a similar exoticized novel? Also, where can the blog mentioned be found? Yeah, we should have mentioned that when you mentioned your blog.
So the blog is called Muslim Impossible, muslimimpossible.com. Kind of a play on Mission Impossible. I don't know, I set myself a date for launching it, and I had to come up with a title, and that ended up being the title. Did I feel any external expectations? Not at all. I never felt like I should write that. In fact, the very opposite. I actually have like toyed with the idea of writing something like maybe a short story. In fact, of one of these types of novels, just for fun, and like put in as many like stereotypes and adjectives that they kind of use, just to see what it would be like to write that kind of thing. And then I thought about writing one of these novels and trying to get it published, pretending that it's not satirical, and seeing if that would work. I've never got around to that because it's kind of a waste of time and effort. But it would be, I don't know, it would be just satisfying to see that happen. Obviously, it's frustrating that these novels are so successful. And then there is another kind of trend of them that kind of took off after, was so weird, that took off after 9/11. Where I call it sexy sheikh lit, where it's like this really weird, erotic novels usually about a white woman being coerced into marriage with a sheikh who's obviously not a sheikh, he's just some man. And it's so full of problems, and I just don't really know what to do with this knowledge. I feel like I can't unclean it from my mind. So that's another, like, and they're so popular and so successful, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I despair. There was something else I wanted to mention on that point. Never mind. But yeah, I never felt like I should write something like that. In fact, I felt like I need to write something that's not this, so that there's alternatives out there.
Yeah, actually, the satire you mentioned, I would really like to read that. So it sounds like a mode of writing that would release some of that frustration about the different.
Oh my gosh, absolutely.
Yeah. One more question from the audience relates to writing advice. What's the best writing advice you could give someone who's starting out and trying to be an author?
You can never read too much. Don't be afraid to like read something that you are worried you're going to copy. Like, read as much within the area that you want to write about. If you're actually in the process of writing, as much as you can with your commitments, schedule time into your day, like writing time. Treat it like a job or a commitment that you have to show up for. Even if you end up writing 100 words, show up and do the work. Okay, she didn't say what one piece of writing advice, because I've started on a list. You kind of need to be, you don't need to be an amazing author, you just need to be motivated. Being a good editor is very helpful, probably more important than being a good writer. Yeah, it's like 90% persistence in my opinion, and 10%, maybe like 5% writing and 5% I'm not sure what else, biscuits.
That always helps, right? So we have about 5 minutes or so. Do you want to say something at this point about where the book can be found? And maybe your future writing plans. We already mentioned the satire short story.
Oh, that's like, it's not even, it's literally,
no, you should write
like 2
it.
pages. But the thing is, it's like, who am I to be like, this? I mean, I do it just to like be able to release and then one day turn around and be like, gotcha. But really, am I going to put in all that time just for that? I don't know. Maybe I'll release it in a short story collection or something one day. Among other people's short stories, I'm going to write a whole collection. It's available. So this is a bit difficult, but in the UK, you can buy it in Waterstones, Amazon, any like major online bookshop, and also it's in some Waterstones bookshops in the US. I mean, let's just say major booksellers around the world. Your best option is to look on Hupu. Let me see what their website is. Hupufiction.com, and then you find the Watermelon Boys, and it gives you some options where to buy it. You can also email them because if you need information that's specific to where you want to buy it. But in the Middle East and North Africa, your best bet is in AUC, anywhere that stocks AUC Press or online shops. Oh, and so my next novel, which I'm now officially, I finished a draft and working on editing it. It's called The Brilliant Red of the Last Hibiscus, which is based on this really cool imagery that came to me when I was writing it, that, you know, plants before, I shouldn't really give this away at this point, but anyway, before plants die, let's say a plant, for example, the hibiscus that's in the title, when there's like they're drying out, or they're lacking water or sun, or for whatever reason they're dying, they do this really cool thing which is called stress something, I've forgotten now, and they put all the energy not into surviving but into creating this last flower. And I thought that was a really cool imagery or metaphor for what my protagonist in this novel does. So the short / very jagged summary is that set in the near future in the UK, as a white passing Muslim woman discovers that a rising political party has Islamophobic intentions, that they're passing off as socialist. And when she finds this out, she takes her family, she goes into hiding until this party kind of, she infiltrates the Ministry of Counterterrorism and tries to sabotage them and essentially get her revenge while bringing them down. So it's very the Watermelon Boys, but I'm really excited. It's been this character who's so almost cowardly and self-confessed coward, which is it's been a really interesting ride, and I'm excited to edit it now.
I'm excited to read it. I'm excited to read it. Sounds amazing, and like you said, very different. But yeah. I can't wait to read it. So I'm going to close by thanking you, Ruqaya. I have really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too, thank you.
And thank you also to the listeners for the questions. I will hand over to Dana now for closing remarks.
Thank you, Ruqaya and Tasnim. We at the Columbia Global Center's Amman really appreciate the interesting conversation that you've both contributed to. You've given us a lot to think about, and our hope is to help give inspiration for more reading and writing of post-colonial literature. A recording of this virtual book talk will be available on our website and on our social media platforms. And we'd also like to thank everyone who sent in questions and our audience for joining us on our book talk series.